Dinner was a peaceful time, with the only sounds being the quiet clinking of cutlery against plates. I had cooked that night, preparing a delicious steak and roasted vegetables, one of Angela's favorite dishes. She didn't say much about it, though. She hadn't said much lately. Her phone was next to her plate, lighting up every few minutes with notifications she didn't seem to mind having there. I watched her across the table, trying to read her expression. She seemed distant, her eyes unfocused, her movements robotic. It wasn't unusual for her lately, but tonight, there was something different about her. There was a subtle edge to her detachment, as if she was waiting for the right moment to speak. And then, without warning, she spoke. "I don't regret spending the night with Henry," she said, her voice calm and measured. She didn't look at me when she said it. Her eyes were fixed on the glass of wine in her hand. I thought I might have misheard her, but then the weight of her words hit me, cold and sharp, like a blade pressed to my skin. I set my fork down slowly, the clink of it against the plate echoing louder than usual in the tense silence. I looked closely at her, my face expressionless, as the room seemed to tilt slightly. "What did you just say?" My tone was quiet, almost like we were just having a casual conversation. I didn't want her to see that I was upset. She finally met my eyes, and I could see a little smirk forming at the corners of her mouth. "You heard me," she said. It was a challenge, and she thought she'd already won. That little smirk of hers, so subtle yet so obvious, made my stomach do that thing it does when you're nervous. I took a sip of my wine, letting the silence stretch between us. She watched me, clearly expecting a reaction, but I gave her none. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, cradling the glass in my hand, as if her words had been nothing more than a passing remark about the weather. "How very bold of you," I said, my voice steady. "Was it worth it?" She didn't flinch. If anything, her smirk deepened. "Yes," she said, her tone dripping with defiance. "Henry knows just how to make me feel alive. Something you haven't done in years." Ah, there it was. The playful jab, the way she justified it. It all added up. I had seen it coming, but hearing it still stung like a punch to the chest. I nodded slowly, taking another sip of wine as I processed her words. "Good to know," I finally said, setting my glass down carefully. "I'm so glad he was able to give you that experience." She blinked, clearly taken aback by my calmness. "That's all you have to say?" "For now," I replied, looking into her eyes. "But don't worry. By morning, I'm sure you'll have plenty to regret." Her smirk faltered then, just for a second, but she quickly recovered. "You're so thoughtful, Jerry. So composed. It's admirable, but it can also be tiring. Maybe that's why Henry feels so refreshing. He doesn't hold back." "Passion," I repeated, the word carrying a hint of disdain. "Is that what you're calling it? Passion? Or perhaps it's just poor judgment wrapped in cheap thrills." Her jaw tightened, and I could see the first crack in her armor. Good. She wasn't as untouchable as she thought. The rest of the meal passed in tense silence. I finished my steak methodically, refusing to let her see even a flicker of the storm brewing inside me. She pushed her food around on her plate, her confidence waning with every passing minute. By the time we finished clearing the table, she seemed restless, her usual smirk gone. "I'm going to bed," she said abruptly, grabbing her phone and heading upstairs without another word. I stayed in the kitchen, poured myself another glass of wine, and leaned against the counter as I replayed the conversation in my mind. Her words lingered in my head, but this time, I didn't feel anger. It was clarity. She thought she had the upper hand, that her admission had given her some kind of power. But she didn't realize who she was dealing with. I wasn't the passive, complacent husband she had convinced herself I was. I'm not that kind of person anymore. As I finished my wine, a plan started to take shape in my mind. I knew that Angela might not regret her actions now, but by the time I was done, she would. Regret would cling to her like a shadow, following her every step. And as for Henry, he'd soon enough learn that crossing me was the worst mistake he ever made. With a steady hand, I rinsed my glass and placed it in the sink. Tomorrow would bring a reckoning, but for tonight, I let the silence of the house settle around me, a calm before the storm I was about to unleash. The morning after Angela's confession, the house was quiet, which felt strange after the usual bustle. She had already left for work by the time I got out of bed, leaving behind the faint scent of her perfume and an untouched cup of coffee on the counter. I stood there for a moment, staring at the mug, thinking about the events of the previous night. Her words, casual, yet so cutting, were like a loop I couldn't turn off. I don't regret spending the night with Henry. This memory made me angry, but I tried not to let it get to me. Anger wasn't going to help. I had learned long ago that patience was the best tool for moments like these. Angela had laid her cards on the table, bold and reckless. Now, it was my turn to play mine, quietly, deliberately, and with precision. I started with the obvious. I had noticed Angela was slipping away from me for months, but I hadn't been able to see it clearly until now. I had noticed the late nights at the office, the last-minute business trips, and the subtle changes in her appearance, like the way she was dressing a little sharper, putting a little more attention into her makeup and her perfume. At first, I thought it was just because of her career. She had always been ambitious, striving for the next big promotion. But now, I could see the signs for what they really were, the classic markers of an affair. Henry. The name made me feel a bit sick to my stomach. I hadn't had the pleasure of meeting him in person, but I had heard about him. Angela had mentioned him a few times in passing, and I could tell she really liked him. At the time, I thought she was just being professional. "He's brilliant," she'd said once, a faint smile playing on her lips. "He has this way of commanding a room, you know?" I didn't know that. And now, I wasn't so sure I wanted to. The rest of the day passed in a haze of half-formed thoughts and calculated restraint. I went about my routine as though nothing had changed, but inside, my mind was working overtime. Angela thought she had caught me off guard with her admission, but she didn't realize I'd been paying attention, watching, observing, connecting the dots. That evening, I decided to test the waters. When Angela came home, she seemed distracted, her phone buzzing with notifications. She put her phone face down on the counter, but not before I caught a glimpse of the name flashing on the screen. "Henry, how was work?" I asked, keeping my tone light as I set the table for dinner. "Fine," she replied a little too quickly. "Busy as usual," she added. "Anything interesting happen?" I pressed, sliding a plate of pasta onto the table. She paused for a moment, her gaze flickered toward her phone. "Nothing worth mentioning," she replied, her voice warm and reassuring. I nodded, sitting across from her. Working so closely with Henry must be exhausting. He seems so intense. Her fork paused midair, her eyes snapping to mine. What do you mean? Just an observation, I replied with a warm smile, taking a sip of water. You've mentioned him a few times. He seems like he's a pretty important person at the company. She relaxed a bit, but her shoulders were still a bit tense. He is. He's the kind of leader who expects excellence, which can be a lot of pressure. I smiled gently, leaning back in my chair. Sounds like he keeps you on your toes. Her expression shifted subtly, and I noticed a hint of something in her eyes. Was it guilt? Anxiety? Whatever it was, it made me feel like I was on the right track. After dinner, she went to the living room, her phone in hand. I stayed in the kitchen, pretending to clean up while keeping an eye on her from the corner of my eye. I could see that she was smiling at the screen, and her thumbs were moving quickly across the keyboard. I could tell that she was texting someone. I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't jealousy, exactly, but a deep, simmering anger. Not just at her, but at myself, too. How had I let things get to this point? How had I missed the signs until now? But I knew self-pity wasn't going to solve anything. If Angela wanted to play this game, I'd be right there with her. I'd do everything I could to find out everything there was to know about her and Henry. Every lie, every betrayal, every moment they thought they could keep hidden. And when the time was right, I'd gently guide her to reconsider her choices. For now, though, I kept my cool. I stayed patient. She thought she was in control, but the truth was, I had already begun to unravel the web she and Henry had spun. She'd realize soon enough just how much I had been paying attention. I started my quiet investigation into Henry with the kind of focus I used to reserve for high-stakes projects at work. This wasn't just about my curiosity or even about Angela's betrayal anymore. No, this was about him. This man who had strolled into our lives, turned my wife into a stranger, and presumed he could walk away unscathed. The first thing I discovered about Henry was how easily people sang his praises, at least on the surface. He was the kind of man who left a lasting impression. Slick, charming, with a razor-sharp wit that seemed to disarm anyone in his presence. In the corporate world, that charm had propelled him to the top. He wasn't just Angela's boss. He was the face of her company's success, the man who knew how to turn every meeting into an event and every deal into a victory lap. But there was more to him than met the eye. I was on the lookout for vulnerabilities, and I soon discovered some. The first clue came during a casual conversation with Nora, my sister and closest confidant. Nora worked in a different industry, but she had an uncanny ability to pick up on corporate gossip. When I mentioned Henry's name casually, her expression immediately shifted. "Henry Bowman?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "That's the one," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "I've heard things about him. Rumors, mostly. But let's be real, he's not as polished as he seems." "Go on," I urged, my interest piqued. Nora paused for a moment, as if thinking about the words she wanted to use, and then she continued. "A friend of mine used to work at one of his previous companies. She said he has a reputation for using people, mostly women. He's the kind of guy who makes promises he doesn't keep, dangles opportunities just out of reach, and then cuts ties when things get messy. It wasn't anything new, but it confirmed my suspicions. It wasn't just a harmless flirtation for Angela. He was a man who thrived on manipulation. My next step was reaching out to Ethan, a friend of mine who worked in corporate compliance. Ethan was discreet, the kind of guy who could find information without leaving a trail. When I asked him to look into Henry's professional history, he didn't bat an eye. A few days later, he called me back. "You were right to be suspicious," he said, his tone serious. "Henry's got a bit of a track record, with some practices that might raise a few eyebrows. He's been involved in 3 different companies over the past decade, and each time, there's been some kind of fallout, lawsuits, accusations of harassment, even an SEC investigation into insider trading at one point." "Anything recently?" I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. "There's a lot of smoke, but no fire. At least, nothing concrete. He's really good at covering his tracks, but if I were you, I'd keep digging. He's a smart guy, and he always leaves a little trail for us to follow." It was exactly the encouragement I needed. Henry wasn't untouchable. He just thought he was. The more I dug, the more I began to see the bigger picture. Henry's interest in Angela wasn't just personal. It was strategic. She wasn't just another fling for him. She was someone he could use to advance his goals. I learned through some casual conversations, which I carefully orchestrated to seem innocent, that she was leading a high-stakes project for the company. It was one that could make or break their next quarter. One evening, Angela mentioned that Henry had been so supportive, her tone almost defensive. "He really believes in me." I fought the urge to scoff. Of course he believed in her. She was the key to his success, the golden ticket he couldn't afford to lose. But Angela didn't seem to see it that way, or maybe she just preferred to ignore it. She was caught up in his world, dazzled by his charm, and too blind to see the strings he was pulling. It made me so angry, not just because of what it meant for our marriage, but because of what it meant for her. She was smarter than this, or at least, I thought she was. I knew then that confronting Henry wouldn't be enough. I knew I had to show everyone, including Angela, what a truly dangerous person he was. I knew I couldn't trust the rumors and whispers I'd heard. I needed proof. Henry might have thought he could manipulate his way through life without consequence, but he was about to learn that he had met his match. I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to dismantle everything he had built, piece by piece. When it was all said and done, he would be the one to regret ever stepping into my world. As I began to look into Henry, the cracks in Angela's perfect facade started to show. She had always carried herself with an air of confidence, especially when it came to her career. But lately, her posture seemed less certain, her smile a little too forced. It was as though the weight of her choices she thought she could control, was finally beginning to catch up to her. I watched from the sidelines, being careful not to do or say anything that might upset her. I knew that confronting her directly wouldn't be the best approach. She was so focused on the fantasy of Henry's charm that she couldn't see the truth. But I could tell something had shifted. She used to talk about Henry a lot during dinner, but now she doesn't even mention his name anymore. When I asked how work was going, she'd give a short, "Fine," and quickly change the subject. What she didn't know was that I already knew why. Henry was beginning to show his true colors, just as I'd predicted. Men like him can't keep the mask on forever. They really thrive on control, and once they felt their grip slipping, the cracks in their facade became impossible to hide. Luckily, I had a few allies in Nora, Ethan, and even Lila, and together we were putting the pieces together. Angela was doing her best to keep up with the high-pressure project that had caught Henry's eye, but it was becoming more and more challenging. Deadlines were being missed, client expectations were spiraling out of control, and Henry, ever the opportunist, was deflecting blame onto her. What had once been his unwavering support had turned into thinly veiled criticism, delivered in front of her colleagues with a precision that left her humiliated and scrambling to defend herself. One evening, she came home looking more exhausted than I'd seen her in years. She looked a little less than her usual sharp self, and her eyes showed the strain of it all. She poured herself a glass of wine and sank into the couch without saying a word. I waited a moment, studying her, before breaking the silence. "Was it a tough day?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She exhaled heavily, staring into her glass. "You could say that. Henry giving you a hard time?" I pressed, careful to keep the question casual. Her head snapped up, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Why would you say that?" I shrugged. "Just a hunch. You've been working closely with him, right? Sometimes those relationships can get complicated." Her jaw tightened, and she looked away. "I'm sure I can handle it," she said, trying to reassure her. I let the subject drop, but her reaction told me everything I needed to know. It seemed like the pedestal she had put Henry on was crumbling, and she was trying to figure out how to deal with the man she had idealized and the reality of who he was. What she didn't realize was that Henry's treatment of her wasn't just about the project. Through Lila, who had been discreetly gathering information while maintaining a friendly facade with Henry, I learned that he had already started looking for a replacement. This replacement was a younger, more malleable employee who lacked Angela's experience but was eager to please. It was his pattern, his modus operandi. Angela had served her purpose, and now it was time for her to move on. I could have easily gloated and confronted her with everything I knew, but I didn't. But I held back. She wasn't ready to face the truth, and I knew I needed to give her the space and time to process everything on her own. If I pushed too hard, she'd just shut down and cling to the fantasy of Henry, even as it crumbled around her. So, instead of rushing in, I waited patiently, observing as the cracks began to show. I saw how her confidence faltered during conversations, how she hesitated before answering work-related questions. I saw her flinch when her phone buzzed with yet another late-night email from Henry, the once thrilling urgency of his attention now a source of dread. One night, as she sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at her laptop, I leaned against the doorway and crossed my arms. "You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders," I said gently. She didn't look up. "It's just work," she said, her voice a soft murmur. "It'll pass." "Will it?" I asked, my voice gentle but curious. "Or is this something bigger?" Her fingers paused on the keyboard, but she didn't respond. For a moment, I thought she might open up, might finally admit that things weren't as perfect as she'd made them out to be. But then she shook her head and went back to typing, shutting me out once again. I took a step back, letting her process things in silence. The truth was coming out, and I knew it was best to let it happen naturally. Henry's mask was slipping, and soon enough, Angela would see him for who he really was. When that moment came, I'd be ready. I'd be ready to expose the full extent of his manipulations and to remind her of the price of betrayal. For now, I waited. This was just the start of things. I've always had a lot of patience. Angela thought she could keep her secrets tucked away, safe behind her carefully curated lies and late nights. But I had been playing this game longer than she realized, and with every passing day, the web around her and Henry grew tighter. It started with small, deliberate moves. Lila, who had taken on the role of my quiet ally, continued her feigned friendship with Henry, meeting him for coffee and casual conversations. Henry thought he was untouchable, and his arrogance made him careless. He'd lean back in his chair, talking about his vision for the company, casually dropping hints about the people he used and discarded along the way. Lila, ever observant, took notes on every word, and little by little, Henry's true self began to show. One evening, Lila told me over the phone, "He's already scouting someone to replace Angela. There's a new hire, young, eager, and totally fresh to the scene. He's grooming her to take over Angela's role." I felt a surge of anger, but I kept my cool. It was exactly as I'd expected. Henry had built his entire career on manipulation, and now he was preparing to throw Angela under the bus. The irony was definitely not lost on me. She had betrayed me for him, and now she was the one being betrayed. Meanwhile, Ethan had been digging into Henry's professional dealings. He found some pretty shady contracts, some pretty dodgy conflicts of interest, and a bunch of employees who were pretty unhappy and had been paid off to keep quiet. It was a pretty damning collection of evidence, and we were only just scratching the surface. "Henry's good at covering his tracks," Ethan said during one of our late-night strategy calls. "But he's not perfect. There's enough here to raise some questions, especially if it comes to light at the right time." I nodded, already picturing how I could use the information. Henry's empire might seem solid, but it's not. We just need to find the right moment to show him that. But the most significant piece of the puzzle came as a surprise. One afternoon, Nora called me, her voice tinged with urgency. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "I just got off the phone with an old colleague of mine, someone who used to work with Henry. He's been doing the same things for years. And get this, one of his previous victims is willing to talk." Her name was Hannah. She had been in a similar position to Angela's, rising star in her company, drawn in by Henry's charm and promises of mentorship. But once she outlived her usefulness, he discarded her, tarnishing her reputation in the process. She had spent years rebuilding her career, and though she had moved on, the scars of Henry's betrayal remained. "I'll talk to her," I told Nora. "If she's willing to share her story, it could be the final piece we need." Meeting Hannah was a sobering experience. She was calm and composed, but there was a sadness in her eyes that spoke volumes. As she shared her journey with Henry, I felt my own anger transform into determination. This wasn't just about Angela or my marriage anymore. This was about exposing a man who had built his success on the broken lives of others. "He thinks he's untouchable," Hannah said, her voice steady. "But even the best of them have their moments. He'll make a mistake, and when he does, you have to be ready." Her words resonated with me as I continued to gather evidence, each piece bringing me closer to the moment I had been waiting for. I knew I couldn't rush this. Henry was slippery, and if I moved too soon, he'd find a way to twist the narrative in his favor. But with the support of Ethan, Nora, Lila, and now Hannah, I was building a strong case that even he couldn't escape. At home, Angela was unraveling. She was coming home later and later, and I could see the tension in her shoulders, even from across the room. She didn't mention Henry anymore, but I could see the cracks beginning to form. He was pulling away from her, just as he had with Hannah and so many others before her. She hadn't said it out loud, but I knew she could feel it too. One night, as she sat on the couch, staring blankly at her laptop, I walked into the room and leaned against the doorway. "You look tired," I said, my voice casual. She glanced up at me, her eyes empty. "It's just work," she said, her voice soft. "Henry's been demanding." I nodded, letting the silence stretch between us. "You know," I added gently, "people like him always demand more than they give. And when they're done, they move on without a second thought." Her head snapped up, and her expression showed a mix of surprise and defensiveness. "What do you mean?" "Just an observation," I replied with a warm smile, turning to leave the room. "Good night, Angela." As I walked away, I could feel her eyes on me, and I could almost hear the weight of my words hanging heavy in the air. She was beginning to realize the truth about Henry, about herself, about the choices she had made. The web was tightening, and soon enough, there would be no escape for either of them. By the time I started putting the pieces into motion, the path ahead was clear. Henry wasn't just a man who had wormed his way into my marriage. He was a man who thrived on control, manipulation, and destruction. And now, he was about to learn what it felt like to have the tables turned. I couldn't do it alone, though. This wasn't a battle that could be won by brute force or heated confrontation. It required strategy, precision, and allies who understood the stakes. That's where Ethan, Nora, Lila, and Hannah came in. Each of them brought something unique to the table. Ethan's meticulous research, Nora's connections, Lila's inside access, and Hannah's first-hand experience with Henry's methods. It was during one of our late-night strategy calls that the plan started to take shape. We met at Nora's apartment, and the quiet hum of the city outside provided the perfect backdrop for the discussions that unfolded. Nora was a gracious host, pouring each of us a hot coffee as Ethan laid out a folder of documents on the table. "Here's what we have so far," Ethan began, gesturing to the papers. "There are financial discrepancies in Henry's previous companies, a bunch of HR complaints that got swept under the rug, and evidence of some not-so-great practices in his current role. While it might not be enough to completely discredit him, it's certainly enough to raise some questions. We just need a few questions to get to the bottom of things." I leaned forward, my eyes narrowing. "We're not going for a knockout punch. We're going to dismantle him piece by piece." The others nodded in agreement, the tension in the room palpable but focused. Hannah spoke up next, her voice steady but laced with a quiet intensity. "I can share my story publicly, but it has to be timed perfectly. If we release it too soon, he'll spin it as a personal vendetta. But if we wait until the evidence builds, it becomes undeniable." Nora finished her coffee, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "He won't be able to escape it." Lila, who had been unusually quiet, finally chimed in. "He's getting careless," she said. "I've been meeting with him regularly, and he's already making moves to replace Angela. He's confident, arrogant, and totally unaware that I'm on to him." Her words lit a fire inside me. I had suspected Henry's plans to discard Angela, but hearing it confirmed only deepened my resolve. He had underestimated her, and me, for the last time. The first step of the plan was simple: expose Henry's manipulations within the company. Using the documents Ethan had gathered and the accounts from Hannah and others, we compiled a dossier that painted a clear picture of Henry's pattern of behavior. Lila was so helpful. She leaked the information to key figures within the company, trusted colleagues who were already wary of Henry's methods. The whispers started almost immediately, growing louder with each passing day. Meanwhile, I focused on Angela. I didn't go straight to her, but I planted seeds of doubt every chance I got. Subtle comments about trust, loyalty, and the consequences of poor decisions. I could see the tension in her shoulders growing with each passing day, the cracks in her confidence widening as she began to realize that her golden savior wasn't as untouchable as she believed. But the real turning point came when we learned about an upcoming corporate gala, a high-profile event where Henry planned to announce a major business deal. It was the perfect opportunity to make a move. The plan for the gala was meticulous. Lila would keep Henry distracted, feeding his ego with just enough flattery to ensure he didn't suspect a thing. Ethan and Nora would work behind the scenes, ensuring that the leaked documents made their way to key attendees. And Hannah would be ready to step forward if the moment called for it, her story serving as the final nail in Henry's coffin. My role was pretty straightforward. Stay cool, stay collected, and wait for the right time to have a heart-to-heart with Angela. I didn't want her blindsided by what was about to unfold, but I also didn't want to tip her off too soon. I wanted her to see the full scope of Henry's downfall and understand just how deeply she had been deceived. The night before the gala, I found her sitting in the living room, her laptop open but untouched. She looked up at me, her expression a bit guarded. "Big night tomorrow," I said casually, pouring myself a drink. She nodded, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. "Yeah, Henry's been really stressed lately. He wants everything to go perfectly. Doesn't he always?" I replied, taking a sip. "But you know what they say about perfection. They say perfection is often hiding something." Her eyes met mine, and I could see a flicker of something. Guilt? Fear? Crossing her face. She opened her mouth to respond, but I didn't give her the chance. "Good luck tomorrow," I said, my tone light and easygoing. "It should be an interesting night." As I left the room, I felt the weight of her gaze on my back. She didn't know it yet, but the world she and Henry had built was about to come crashing down, and I would be there to watch every moment of it unfold. The night of the gala had a strange electricity in the air, the kind that tightens your chest and makes you hyper-aware of every detail. I had spent weeks planning this moment, and now that it was here, I felt calm. I felt so much calmer than I had in months. This wasn't just about my marriage or my dignity. It was a chance for Henry to face the music. He was a guy who loved a good con, and he was good at it. Tonight, he would finally face the consequences of his actions. Angela and I arrived together, looking like the perfect couple. She wore a beautiful black dress, her smile looking a bit stiff, as if she was holding an attention beneath the surface. She hadn't said much on the drive over, and her grip on her clutch was tighter than usual. I couldn't help but wonder if she had an inkling of what was on the horizon, if she could sense the storm gathering just out of her sight. The gala itself was a grand affair, held in one of the city's most opulent venues. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the room, and the buzz of conversation filled the air. Henry was already there, of course, enjoying the attention as though he were the guest of honor. He stood near the center of the room, holding court with a group of executives and board members. His charisma was on full display, and his laughter echoed above the crowd like a performer confident in his act. I hung out at the edges, taking it all in, waiting for the right moment. Ethan, Nora, and Lila were already in position. Ethan had made sure that the dossier containing the damning evidence of Henry's unethical practices had been distributed to key players in the room earlier that day. Nora was mingling with ease, gently guiding conversations towards Henry's past. Lila was with him, playing her part perfectly, Her laughter was soft and conspiratorial as she kept him occupied. Then, Hannah arrived quietly, slipping into the room unnoticed. She wore a simple dress, and her demeanor was calm but determined. We shared a quick nod across the room. She knew her role, and I trusted her to play it when the time was right. The evening went like clockwork. We had dinner, everyone gave speeches, and the room filled with excitement as Henry prepared to make his big announcement. Angela stayed close to me, but I could tell she was thinking about something else. Her eyes kept darting toward Henry, and I could see the unease creeping in. She wasn't sure what was wrong, but she could feel it, like the moment before a thunderstorm, when the air grows heavy and still. Finally, the moment arrived. Henry took the stage, his confidence radiating as he addressed the room. He spoke about the company's success, his vision for the future, and the groundbreaking deal they were about to close. The crowd applauded, and it was clear they were impressed. But then, as he was enjoying the applause, the first hint of uneasiness started to spread through the room. It started with a whisper, a phone screen illuminated here, a hushed conversation there. The dossier had begun to circulate, its contents undeniable. Emails detailing Henry's manipulations, records of financial discrepancies, and testimonials from former employees painted a less than flattering picture of the man standing on the stage. Henry started to stumble, his smile fading as he noticed the change in the room. His voice faltered a bit as he continued, but the whispers grew louder, the tension thickened. Then, Hannah stood up. "I'd like to say something," she said, her voice clear and steady. Everyone turned to look at her, and Henry, feeling the weight of his actions, stood there with his hand on the microphone. Hannah took a step forward, her gaze fixed warmly on Henry. "You talk about vision and leadership," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "But the truth is, you've built your success on lies. You've used people, manipulated them, and discarded them when they were no longer useful." "I know, because I was one of them." The room went silent, and everyone could feel the weight of her words. Henry opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Nora spoke up. "There's more," she said, holding up a printed copy of the dossier. "Everything you need to know about Henry Bowman is in here. His financial misconduct, his unethical behavior, his pattern of abuse, it's all documented." Then, the floodgates opened. Questions, accusations, and murmurs of disbelief filled the room. Henry tried to regain control, his voice rising in desperation, but it was too late. The evidence was overwhelming, and the witnesses were too credible to dismiss. His carefully constructed image was crumbling before his eyes. Angela stood frozen beside me, her face pale as she watched the scene unfold. She turned to me, her voice barely a whisper. "Did you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I met her gaze, my expression unreadable. "He did this to himself." Henry stormed out of the room shortly after, his departure marked by a deafening silence. The gala continued, but the energy had shifted. The guests no longer chatted about deals and successes. They spoke of betrayal and downfall. Angela didn't say much on the drive home. She gazed out the window, her hands clasped together. I let the silence linger, knowing she had a lot to process. Tonight, she had seen Henry for who he truly was. By morning, she would have to face the full weight of her choices and their consequences. The morning after the gala was a bit of a doozy, the kind of quiet that just feels like a fog, heavy and a bit suffocating. I woke up earlier than usual, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the previous night. Henry's carefully crafted world had come crashing down in a spectacular, public fashion. And poor Angela, she'd been caught in the wreckage. When I finally got up, she was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee untouched in front of her. She was still in her robe, her hair pulled back into a messy bun. She didn't look at me when I came in, but I could see she was nervous. Her shoulders were tense, and her fingers were shaking a little as they held the coffee mug. "Morning," I said, pouring myself a cup of coffee. She didn't respond, just stared down at her coffee as though it held answers she desperately needed. I sat across from her, taking a slow sip and letting the silence stretch. I didn't want to be the one to do it. After a while, she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you know?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did I know what?" I asked, my tone gentle. She looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed and filled with something I couldn't quite place. Anger? Sadness? Guilt? About Henry. About everything that happened last night. I carefully set my cup down and met her gaze. "I had an idea," I said, my voice gentle. "It wasn't hard to figure out, Angela. The signs were all there." Her expression changed, and she pressed a hand to her forehead. "I didn't see it. I didn't see any of it. How could I have been so clueless?" I leaned back in my chair, watching her closely. "Because you didn't want to see it. You let yourself believe in the version of Henry that he wanted you to see, the charming, supportive boss. But last night, that was the real Henry." She flinched at my words, her hand dropping to her lap. "You don't have to rub it in, Jerry." "I'm not rubbing it in," I replied gently. "I'm just telling you the truth. Henry never did that, though." She let out a sad laugh, shaking her head. "You must think I'm pathetic, falling for his lies, letting him manipulate me." I didn't respond right away. To be honest, I wasn't sure what I was thinking anymore. Deep down, a part of me wanted to agree with her, to gently push back against her betrayal. But another part of me, a part one wasn't sure I trusted, felt something close to pity. "What I think," I said after a long pause, "is that you made a mistake. A big one. Now, it's time for you to decide what you're going to do about it." Her gaze met mine, her eyes narrowing in surprise. "What should I do, Jerry? My reputation is ruined. My career is probably over. I've lost everything." "Everything?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Is that what you think? That you've lost everything?" She paused, blushing slightly. "I didn't mean, you didn't mean me," I finished for her, my voice a soft, reassuring tone. "Of course not. Because in all of this, you never once considered what you were throwing away. Our marriage, our trust. You didn't lose everything, Angela. You gave it away, my dear." Her lips parted as if to argue, but no words came out. She looked away, her hands clenching into fists on the table. I thought she might cry, but she didn't. Instead, she took a deep breath and stood up straight, as though she was preparing herself for a battle she knew she couldn't win. "You're right," she finally said, her voice quiet but steady. "I made a mistake. I let him mess with my head and ruin everything I'd worked so hard for. But I'm not going to let him destroy me." There it was, the fire I hadn't seen in her for months. She was still the same woman who had built a successful career, and had once been my partner in every sense of the word. She was just buried under layers of guilt and regret. I hope you mean that, I said, standing up and taking my coffee with me. Because rebuilding what you've broken won't be easy, and it's going to take some time. She didn't say much, but her eyes conveyed determination as I left the room. For the first time in months, I felt the faintest glimmer of hope. But it wasn't for us, not just yet. But it was a glimmer of hope that Angela could find her way back to herself. As time went on, the effects of the gala started to become clearer. Henry was facing an internal investigation, and his career was hanging by a thread. Angela, on the other hand, started taking small steps to rebuild her life. She resigned from her position at the company, cutting ties with the man who had nearly destroyed her. At home, things were a bit tense. We spoke in short, clipped sentences, careful not to venture into dangerous territory. But there were moments, small, fleeting moments, where I saw glimpses of the woman I had fallen in love with. Like when she told me a joke over dinner, or quietly thanked me for a cup of tea. These moments weren't grand gestures, but they were enough to keep me hopeful. For now, that would have to be enough. The days after Angela resigned were marked by a strange calm in our house. The chaos of the gala and its aftermath had subsided, and we found ourselves in a sort of in-between state, a place between the ruins of the past and the unknown future. I wasn't sure where we stood, but for the first time in months, I could see that Angela was beginning to grasp the weight of her choices. One morning, I found her in the living room, surrounded by stacks of papers and her laptop. She was still in her pajamas, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, and there was an intensity in her expression that I hadn't seen in years. She was so engrossed in whatever she was working on that she didn't notice me at first. I stood there, my heart pounding a bit, watching her with a mix of curiosity and a hint of hope. After a moment, I finally summoned the courage to speak. "Starting a new project?" I asked, my tone light and friendly. She looked up, surprised, and for a moment, I saw a hint of guilt in her eyes. But then she straightened, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Something like that," she said quietly. "I'm trying to figure out my next step." I strolled over and took a peek at the papers scattered on the coffee table. Resumes, notes, a list of potential companies she could apply to. It was clear she wasn't just sitting in her guilt. She was planning, rebuilding. Leaving the company was the right choice, I said, sitting down across from her. But what about everything else? Have you thought about what you're going to do to fix that? Her hands paused over the keyboard, and she met my gaze. If you mean whether I've thought about us, the answer is yes. I think about it constantly. Thinking about it isn't enough, Angela, I said, my voice steady but firm. You can't undo what happened, but if you want to move forward, you need to take accountability. It's not just with me, but with yourself. She nodded slowly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I know," she said. I'm trying. I've been keeping a journal, and I've started looking for a therapist. I know I need to understand why I let things with Henry happen before I can even think about asking you to forgive me." Her honesty took me by surprise. For so long, she'd been defensive, dismissive, unwilling to acknowledge the depth of her betrayal. But now, for the first time, she seemed ready to face it head-on. It didn't take away the pain, but it was a start. "I don't need perfection, Angela," I said after a long pause. "But I need to see effort. Real effort. If you're serious about fixing this, I'm willing to try. But you have to meet me halfway. Her eyes glistened as she looked at me. I will, Jerry. I promise. I'll do whatever it takes. The rest of the day passed quietly, but something had shifted between us. It wasn't a complete reconciliation yet, but it was a step forward. But it was a step toward one. Later that evening, as we sat together on the couch watching a movie, I felt a tentative sense of hope for the first time in months. It felt like we were on the same side, both fighting to rebuild something that had been broken. We weren't perfect, but we were trying. Maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to move forward together. It's interesting how sometimes silence can feel heavier than words. In the days that followed our conversation, Angela and I were on a first time trying to be friends kind of vibe. We didn't fight, and we didn't push each other away. Instead, we moved around each other carefully, like two people walking on thin ice, unsure of how one step might send us plunging into the cold. Angela spent most of her time focusing on herself, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw her putting in real effort. She started therapy, as she had promised, and came home from her sessions with an expression that was a mix of exhaustion and relief. At night, she would sit on the couch with a journal, her pen moving quickly across the pages as though she were trying to exorcise her guilt onto paper. I didn't ask what she wrote in her journal. I wasn't quite prepared for that level of vulnerability from her, and maybe she wasn't ready to share it just yet. Instead, I watched from a distance, letting her take the steps she needed to take while keeping my own boundaries firmly in place. Even as she worked to rebuild herself, there was a part of me that remained guarded. Could we really fix this? Could I ever look at her and not see Henry's shadow lingering in the background? These questions nagged at me, and the answers felt out of reach. One evening, as we sat in the living room, her with her journal, me with a book I wasn't really reading, she broke the silence. I talked about you in therapy today, she said, her voice soft but steady. I looked up, surprised. Oh. She set her journal aside, folding her hands in her lap. My therapist asked me why I was so drawn to Henry, why I let myself ruin what we had for someone like him. I stayed silent, letting her know I was listening. And I realized something, she said, her gaze fixed on her hands. It wasn't about Henry at all. It was about me. It was about my own insecurities, my need for validation, my inability to face the parts of myself that felt broken. Her words hung in the air, raw and unpolished, but they felt honest in a way I hadn't expected. I closed my book and leaned forward slightly, my body language conveying that I was listening with full attention. And what about us? I asked. Where do we fit into that? She looked up, her eyes meeting mine. You were always so reliable, Jerry. You were always there for us. But I didn't realize how much I needed you. I stopped appreciating you, stopped appreciating what we had, because I was too caught up in chasing something that didn't matter. I see that now. I hate that it took losing so much to realize it. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she quickly wiped at her eyes, as if embarrassed by the tears. I'm not sure if I can forgive you right now, I said, my voice gentle. It's going to take time. And honestly, I don't know if we'll ever get back to what we were before. I don't want what we had before, she said quietly. I want something better, something honest. That admission hit me harder than I expected. For the first time, it felt like we were speaking the same language, both of us acknowledging the pain, the betrayal, but also the sliver of hope that we might be able to build something new. But over the next few weeks, things didn't magically fix themselves. There were still moments of tension, still nights when the memories of what had happened threatened to pull me under. But there were also moments of connection, small, tentative steps toward healing. Like when we shared a laugh over a silly TV show, a quiet walk in the park. There was a conversation that felt more honest than anything we'd had in years. Angela wasn't the same person she was before Henry, and neither was I. But maybe that was okay. Maybe this new version of us, a little scarred but still standing, was worth fighting for. As I sat next to her one evening, our hands brushed lightly, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time.